A millionaire tries to mock a girl, but is shocked to learn she speaks 7 languages. A millionaire thought it would be just another show of power, a cold meeting, an undecipherable document displayed like a trophy, a provocation meant to put everyone in their place. But when the employee's daughter, sitting quietly in the back with her backpack still on, opened her mouth and filled the room with 7 languages: English, Spanish, French, Arabic, Russian, Italian, and Mandarin, the script collapsed. Laughter turned into silence, certainty turned into doubt, and the planned humiliation became a mirror. From that moment on, a true turning point emerged: the creation of a public space for languages, vocational training, music and sports, weaving together a stronger community and sparking the inner transformation of a man who learned to trade control for presence. A year later, the impact could be seen in neighborhood streets, in doors opening to new opportunities, and in an award that simply confirmed what everyday life had already proven. Buckle up. This story doesn't end with the shock, it begins with it. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The city stirred with distant sirens, engines climbing up Park Avenue, and a cold wind pushing the first shadows between the buildings. While high above at 735th Avenue, the glass-walled office of Richard Caldwell filled with light. He always arrived before 7, adjusted his tie in the reflection, and followed a routine no one dared interrupt. He reviewed performance reports, approved invisible cuts, and replanned targets on spreadsheets that dictated the mood of hundreds of employees. The main office took up half the floor, glass from wall to wall, thick carpet that muffled footsteps, and sleek furniture that spoke more of control than comfort. The 50-year-old founder of Caldwell Systems carried on his face the certainty that had solidified with each profitable quarter, each successful acquisition, each meeting where the final word was a nearly imperceptible nod, signaling that the discussion was over. Shelves displayed awards, framed contracts, prototypes of hardware that looked like cold sculptures, a collection of pens never used, and an old document kept in a stiff folder, an artifact bought at an online auction that he liked to showcase. As a cultural curiosity, another trophy to fit his aesthetic of triumphs. Directors arrived with prepared folders, security made a discreet round, and his personal assistant set down a black coffee on the desk before disappearing without a word. On the screen, the semester's goals flashed like a flight control panel, and Richard thought about the agreements he would sign that morning with 2 funds, along with the announcement of a new internal program focused on individual performance. No teams, no community, everyone for themselves. Results on the table by 6 p.m. He studied the city below with the same gaze he used for charts, a sum of numbers rising and falling, comforted by a world he could translate into percentages, margins, and indexes. A universe that bent to his logic of cause and effect. Far from the glow of digital panels, Lavra Carter woke before her alarm in the small 2-bedroom apartment in Jackson Heights, Queens, the noise of the old heater competing with buses rumbling along Roosevelt Avenue. She got up, tied back her hair, checked her navy blue uniform, worn-out sneakers that had seen countless office corridors, and a badge with her name and the Caldwell Systems logo. She made simple coffee, slipped an apple into her daughter's backpack, made sure her homework was packed, her coat zipper still intact, and that the subway schedule would allow her to make the shift change on time. Lavra had worked at the company for years, knew by memory every stubborn stain on the glass, every corridor draft, every meeting room with cold tables and hard chairs, and was respected by colleagues as the one who solved whatever popped up. From a sudden clog to a discreet leak no one could know about. There was no heroic speech, just work fitted between subway schedules, grocery lists, and bills to pay, with a quiet pride in keeping things running, and never missing a day out of laziness. Walking the upper floors, she caught the reflection of hurried people in suits, stepped aside to make room, avoided getting in the way, scribbled down quick requests in her notepad, and returned short smiles to those who thanked her. In her pocket, she carried an emergency subway ticket for her daughter and a pen gifted by her supervisor at year's end, a small keepsake that had signed school permission slips and notes for the neighbor. Life moved with the cadence of someone who knows stability is built every day, task by task, corridor by corridor, keeping her name clean on the timesheet and her head high when the elevator doors opened to a director checking his watch. When she finished a sector and saw the clear reflection on the glass dividers, she thought about dinner later: fluffy rice, thinly cut vegetables, bills sorted on the table with colored clips, and the exhaustion that would come alongside the satisfaction of another day completed. Emily Carter was 12 and kept a black notebook where she wrote alphabets from other places, symbols that looked like they had come from ancient maps, with ribbon markers dividing English, Spanish, French, Arabic, Russian, Italian, and Mandarin. 7 tabs filled with notes on pronunciation, vocabulary, and everyday phrases. Her bedroom shared space with a shelf stacked with public library books, borrowed volumes rotated every 2 weeks, and a basic cell phone with cheap earbuds that played videos of teachers speaking slowly, step by step, repeating sounds until her ear obeyed. Emily woke early to listen to 20 minutes of French audio, repeated bonjour, wrote bonjour with an arrow labeled good greeting, jotted down sentences for asking directions on the subway, marked what she understood with a green pen, and flagged what needed review in red. In the afternoon, at the 82nd Street Community Center, she gathered 3 or 4 kids from the block to practice greetings in colors, used homemade flashcards, improvised memory games with words and pictures, showed with her fingers how to form Arabic sounds missing in English, and laughed when someone stretched out merci into merci, turning it into a joke. There was no private tutor, no paid class, just Wi-Fi from the building, used books bought at a church bazaar, and conversations with neighbors from Syria, China, Colombia, and Russia, each with their own way of explaining, each patient enough to repeat. Emily had a method no one had taught her, hours spent copying by ear and memory, organized by her own discipline and curiosity. She made tables comparing basic verbs across 7 columns, stuck Post-its on the fridge with daily words, set deadlines to review accent marks, created weekly mini-goals, and when she saw a friend ready to give up, she sat beside her and turned the study into something doable. Small wins, a simple dialogue done right, a greeting with better pronunciation, a sentence written without mistakes. What drove her was the moment of clarity when a complicated sentence finally made sense, when a hard sound clicked, when a neighbor smiled in surprise hearing their native language come from a child who had learned it with respect and real interest. In the financial district, Richard's building worked like a soundless machine. Entry through controlled turnstiles, marble reception, elevators shooting up floors in seconds. A cafeteria where the coffee always tasted fresh, and hallways with constant air conditioning cold enough that jackets were worn even in July. His day's plan was laid out in a calendar he leafed through without sentiment-timed meetings. Investor calls, a presentation to the board, another shorter one for strategic clients. The old document in the stiff folder, purchased to decorate his success narrative, had been the subject of conversation at a dinner the week before. When Richard spoke about languages and translations, the way one talks about expensive art, an object to spark curiosity and project mastery over something he didn't actually understand. The piece amused him for serving as a provocation, a puzzle that drew comments and placed guests in the role of spectators. In the office, his assistant set down the morning agenda. Topics marked in red: cost-cutting goals, churn graphs, client satisfaction indexes, and a sanitized summary on brand reputation. Richard read briskly and didn't dwell on the last line. APR, warning about criticism on community networks over the company's coldness in local sponsorships. He believed that as long as the profit machine kept running, any noise would be absorbed. Nothing a polished announcement couldn't contain. The windows framed the motion on Fifth Avenue. Yellow cabs, hurried pedestrians, shop windows changing into fall mannequins, and he felt the usual sense of command, confident that another quarter would close above industry margins. The way he adjusted his suit jacket before walking into the boardroom came from years of repetition, a ritual that fed his conviction that the world bowed to those who arrived early and spoke in low, decisive numbers. The clock read 7:52 on a Tuesday that would seem identical to others in the company's record, with minutes, signatures, and discreet toasts. At least that's how it all began. In Laura and Emily's neighborhood, the morning smelled of fresh bread. People passed by carrying bags of fruit. Strollers rolled down sidewalks where conversations overlapped in 3 or 4 languages. The subway rattled overhead on an elevated track, its rumble mixing with the pedestrian lights beeping, and the clang of shop shutters rolling open and shut in front of clothing and used electronics stores. Emily pulled her jacket tight, checked that her black notebook was in her backpack, and unfolded a small paper with her daily plan. 15 minutes of Russian reading at recess, 20 minutes reviewing Italian verbs, 10 minutes of Arabic audio. Before dinner, and an hour at the community center for dialogue games with neighborhood kids. Her simple phone set alarms for each block of study, and she had a color code for tricky pronunciations, stickers inside the cover to consult on the subway. Lavra watched her daughter chart her own path of learning and quietly felt relief that curiosity and method had replaced apathy, a relief she translated into careful meals, fixed bedtimes, and clean coats ready in the closet. The night before, Emily had helped a neighbor write a note in Spanish to her son's school, and the joy of solving a simple problem had lit up the whole room. There was no audience, no post online, just small acts of usefulness that made the day lighter. A translated request, a filled-out form, a phrase understood at the doctor's office. Meanwhile, in Richard's building, the cafeteria served flawless omelets and juice in glass cups, while the social elevator filled with discreet ties, leather briefcases, and polished laptops, each passenger already absorbed in their next meeting. The distance between these worlds was only a 30-minute subway ride. It had felt like years when comparing the smells, the conversations, and the weight of being accustomed either to being noticed or to being overlooked. Lavra tightened the strap of her bag and headed for the bus stop, focused on her duties, while Emily folded her schedule and tucked it into the outer pocket of her backpack, ready for another day of studying and small improvised lessons with kids. Discovering that a single word could open a door. When Richard walked through the anteroom into the main boardroom, the filtered air was its usual chill. The table gleamed spotless, the seats were aligned, and the screens already displayed. The presentation's opening slide. He touched the stiff folder with his fingertips and carried it along out of habit, like choosing an accessory to complete his presence, never imagining it would become a talking point later that day. The CFO adjusted the slides. Legal presented a revised draft. The product lead smirked slightly while pointing at the chart supporting the quarter's bet. Nothing in their gestures suggested distraction. Everything followed the protocol of efficiency Richard demanded. Across the city, Emily glanced at a poster in the library with times for conversation clubs, texted a friend to remind her about the afternoon's French activity, and went back to repeating the Italian accent rule she'd found on a blog. Lavra arrived at the tall building with her badge ready, checked in, and received the list of rooms for the day, writing down neatly where she would start, what supplies were missing, and how much time she had for each floor. The city turned its gears under the same sky, each person taking their post with the focus work requires. At the top of Caldwell Systems, the stopwatch on the first meeting began to tick, and Richard's voice filled the room with numbers, targets, and clear instructions on what needed to be delivered by week's end. He relished that sense of control, convinced nothing escaped the hand that had steered the company since its first investment. And yet, out in the streets, on buses, at library tables, there were other metrics unfolding task lists that never made it into reports, learning built with patience, small steps that didn't pop champagne but changed the rhythm of an entire household. The chapter moved with the pace of an ordinary New York morning. Calendars packed, responsibilities spread, commitments marked, and each path kept its straight line until the afternoon, when the solid routine of Richard, Laura, and Emily would meet a question not born of chance, but of the steady voice of someone who learns a little more every single day. The morning unfolded at its usual pace inside Caldwell Systems. On the 26th floor, hurried footsteps of executives echoed down the hall. Muffled conversations blended with the sliding of automatic doors and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted from cups neatly lined up in the break area. On the floor above, the boardroom was already nearly full, its chairs taken by directors of finance, marketing, technology, and the group of lawyers carrying folders stuffed with contracts. Richard Caldwell sat at the head of the table, the stiff folder with the old document resting at his right, and with restrained gestures, he directed each stage of the agenda. The big screen projected graphs in cool shades of blue ascending, lines and sturdy bars designed to uphold the narrative of steady growth. No one dared interrupt, and whenever a voice rose to suggest a change, a single lift of Richard's eyebrow was enough to silence the discussion. The room seemed to follow a silent choreography, everyone attending to their tasks with caution, careful not to draw a reprimand. It was just past 9 when the hiss of the glass door sliding open drew every eye. Briefly throwing the meeting off its axis, Laura Carter entered with her head slightly bowed, her uniform immaculate, the gloves tucked neatly in her apron pocket. She pushed the cleaning cart stocked with cloths, sprays, and folded trash bags, the tools she used daily, as familiar to those Carters as she was. Beside her walked Emily, backpack slung over her shoulders, her eyes scanning the room with restrained curiosity. At reception, Laura had explained she couldn't find anyone to stay with her daughter, and the supervisor reluctantly allowed the girl in on the condition she stayed quietly in a corner while her mother worked. Laura kept silent, moving discreetly toward the side table to collect empty cups, always avoiding direct eye contact with the executives, fully aware that her presence might be considered a distraction. Emily stood by the cart, carefully observing the details around her, the glow of the screens, the firm tone of the men in suits, the cold expressions. Following each graph, Richard noticed the movement and paused his speech for a few seconds. His eyes narrowed as he registered the unexpected presence. He had no objection to the cleaning staff when they blended into the background, but an interruption during a high-level meeting presented itself as an opportunity to reinforce the hierarchy he valued so much. With a curt gesture, he ordered the girl to sit in a chair against the wall and told her mother to continue her work quietly. His tone wasn't sharp enough to sound openly insulting, but it carried the usual disdain of someone who spoke without seeing the other person as an equal. A few directors exchanged quick glances, showing nothing but unease. The atmosphere thickened, but Richard quickly resumed speaking, opening the folder and once again displaying the old document he liked to flaunt as an exotic piece in the middle of negotiations. In a firm voice, he explained that the manuscript was a mystery that had stumped experts paid dearly to crack it, an enigma written in several languages that had never been resolved. He used the story as a demonstration of power, proof that he could acquire anything even if he didn't understand it. At every meeting, The details served both as entertainment and as reinforcement of his image. When he noticed Emily's focused gaze, Richard saw an opening to put on a show. He laid the document on the marble table, opened it to a marked page, and asked with heavy irony whether the girl, there only because she had followed her mother on a cleaning shift, could possibly understand words that not even linguistic scholars had managed to decipher. The restrained chuckle of a few attendees rippled through the room, more out of obedience to authority than genuine amusement. Laura moved closer, trying to intervene with a quick plea for her daughter to be left alone, but Richard signaled for her silence. Emily, seated now, straightened her posture, rested her backpack on the floor, and fixed her gaze on the papers. The silence deepened. The directors discreetly leaned forward, eager to see how the scene would unfold. Richard expected a confused gesture, maybe a timid answer that would confirm his assumptions about social and intellectual limits. Instead, Emily drew a steady breath, kept her gaze locked, and answered calmly that she wasn't a professional translator, but the question seemed strange since he himself couldn't read the document either. The reply cut through the room like a clean, effortless line. A few executives swallowed hard. Richard froze for a moment. Laura gripped the cloth tighter, torn between scolding her daughter and hiding the sudden pride that welled up from hearing her speak with such clarity. The meeting lost its rigid composure for a moment. Emily continued to hold the billionaire's gaze, showing not the slightest trace of fear. Richard attempted to reclaim control, adjusted his tie, laughed loudly, and said it was easy to talk. But repeating phrases wasn't enough. Real knowledge of languages was required. Emily then listed, in a steady and serene voice, the languages she spoke: English, Spanish, French, Arabic, Russian, Italian, and Mandarin. With each word, the room grew heavier with silence. She explained that she had learned on her own through borrowed books, free videos and apps, and conversations with immigrant neighbors who were part of the community, and that she was already sharing this knowledge by helping local children take their first steps in studying languages. Richard forced a smile, but his eyes betrayed his surprise. This was not the answer he had anticipated, and the meeting that was supposed to cement his dominance had turned into a stage of discomfort he no longer controlled. The silence that followed Richard's provocation carried a different weight than usual. Normally, meetings unfolded at the rigid pace he dictated, and no one dared to stray from the graphs and reports. But now, with the old document spread open on the table, everyone waited to see how a 12-year-old girl would respond to the challenge. Richard leaned back in his chair, an ironic smile playing at his lips, convinced the situation would end with the girl frozen in silence or fumbling through an excuse. Emily, however, didn't look away. Calmly, she stepped closer to the table, set her backpack on the floor, and let her fingers glide across the manuscript's yellowed pages. Laura remained still at the back of the room, cleaning cloth in hand, too afraid to interrupt. The directors, who moments earlier had stifled chuckles, now watched with curiosity, surprised by the firmness of the child standing at the center of such a formal setting. Richard issued the challenge plainly, asking Emily to prove, in front of everyone, whether she truly knew the languages she claimed to speak. His intent was obvious: to strip away her confidence and turn the moment into a joke. Emily took a deep breath and opened the document. Tracing a line with her fingertip, she spoke a short phrase in French, her pronunciation crisp and precise, repeating it slowly so everyone could hear the sound exactly as it should be. She didn't translate, offering only the fluency of someone who knew the language. Then, she turned the page and read in Spanish, her words flowing naturally, effortlessly. The sharp contrast between Richard's sarcasm and the girl's clarity plunged the room into absolute silence. None of the executives dared comment. At the back, Laura tightened her grip on the cloth, torn between fearing the billionaire's reaction and feeling the pride rising in her chest as her daughter's voice carried so confidently through the air. Emily continued, now in Italian. The gentle sound of the words rolled off her tongue almost melodically, and she quickly explained how certain structures resembled Spanish, showing that she understood the connections between the Romance languages. One director raised his eyebrows, ever so slightly, recognizing the accuracy of her pronunciation, but said nothing. Moving on, Emily pointed to symbols she recognized from Russian. She spoke a short sentence, the firm consonants carrying the cadence unique to the language, standing in sharp contrast to the previous ones. The air conditioning hummed cold, but the room felt suspended, as if everyone was holding their breath. With each new word, Richard fiddled with his pen, trying to mask the tension building inside him. When Emily switched to Arabic, the deep, drawn-out sounds of the language resonated with striking intensity in the boardroom. She explained calmly that she had picked up much of it by talking with neighbors in the community, repeating sounds and expressions until they felt natural. There was nothing theatrical about her delivery, only clarity. With each language she revealed, Richard's discomfort grew. He had bought the old manuscript as nothing more than a prop, a piece of ostentation. Yet here was a girl from modest beginnings, deciphering what his well-paid translators had failed to do. The smile he wore was already strained, his eyes fixed on her with a mix of surprise and unease. Finally, Emily spoke a few phrases in Mandarin, the most distant of all the languages. Her intonation was steady, her cadence sharp and accurate, respecting the tonal demands of the language. The room, used only to technical reports in English, seemed to drink in each syllable with disbelief. The directors exchanged quick glances, careful not to reveal too much. Emily closed the manuscript, placed her hands on the table, and said only that she was still learning, that she had much more to study, but that she dedicated herself every day because she believed speaking different languages was a way of connecting with people from all over the world. There was no arrogance in her tone-only simplicity. Richard leaned back again, crossed his arms, and let out a short laugh, trying to reclaim control. He remarked that it was curious to see such effort in someone so young, but dismissed it as nothing more than a skill with little real value. The comment rang hollow. The directors sat motionless, unable to dismiss what they had just witnessed. Emily picked her backpack up from the floor, kept her gaze steady, and waited in silence, showing no hint of anxiety. The meeting had lost its original rhythm, and though Richard tried to redirect focus to the charts, it was clear that the moment had left its mark on everyone present. Laura pushed the cart toward the door, her daughter walking beside her, while the room was left shrouded in a strange silence. Richard tapped his fingers against the table, unsettled by the memory he couldn't shake. The image of a simple girl, standing before Maul, reading in 7 languages he himself would never understand. The glass door slid shut behind Laura and Emily, but the sharp sound did not restore the rhythm that usually governed Richard Caldwell's meetings. The digital clock on the wall kept ticking. The big screen still displayed the finance department's graphs. The carefully arranged papers lay before the directors. Yet the atmosphere hung in an uneasy pause no one knew how to break. Richard was used to gatherings that obeyed his strict order, each of his remarks followed by quick nods of agreement, every observation reinforced by charts and numbers that supported his narrative. But that morning, what lingered in everyone's mind was not the projected targets nor the reports justifying cuts, but the image of a 12-year-old girl naturally speaking phrases in French, Spanish, Arabic, Russian, Italian, and Mandarin, as though she were in a modest study room instead of standing before the leadership of one of the country's largest tech firms. Richard twirled his pen between his fingers, trying to mask his discomfort, tugging at his tie repeatedly, but the gesture revealed more than it concealed. It was clear the scene had turned against him, and although he forced a facade of indifference, his eyes betrayed the growing irritation sparked by a memory he could not shake. He drew in a long breath, leaned forward over the table, and tried to reclaim his authority through tone. He advanced the slides with firm clicks, highlighted positive figures, spoke of margins above the industry average, insisted that this would be the company's most profitable quarter in years. But the words rang hollow, echoing in a room that no longer responded as before. Usually, every mention of a target surpassed was met with a chorus of subtle affirmations, heads nodding quickly, executives scribbling notes with urgency to capture every detail. This time, their gazes drifted. Some stared blankly at the screen without following. Others focused on their own hands, avoiding direct eye contact. The latter to his left hadn't tapped his pen in minutes. The marketing director seemed fixated on the table's surface, as if searching for something carved into the grain. Richard caught every detail, feeling irritation rise in waves. His wounded pride pushed him to raise his voice, to quicken his tempo, as though sheer force of energy could fill the void left by silence. Yet the harder he spoke, the clearer it became that nothing he said could overshadow the memory of that girl, standing before them, reciting languages none of them commanded. Meanwhile, outside, Lavra pushed the cleaning cart, its wheels squeaking softly with each turn, the metallic sound echoing louder than usual in the hallway. She walked briskly, her face set, gripping the damp cloth tightly in her hand. Emily walked silently by her side, her backpack bumping against her hip, showing no excess of emotion, only the calm of someone who felt she had done the right thing. Lavra didn't know whether to scold her for her boldness or to embrace her, with the pride swelling in her chest, but either choice risked failing. She only knew the episode would not go unnoticed. Emily's reflection in the glass walls of the corridor showed her standing tall, walking with steady steps, and the mother recognized in her a strength she had never seen so vividly expressed. In the service elevator, they waited in silence, the muffled sounds of meetings on other floors leaking faintly through the metal doors. Emily watched the illuminated numbers on the panel, replaying in her mind the looks she had caught inside that room. The instant when the billionaire had no reply, the brief murmurs stifled among the executives, the surprised expressions no one dared voice aloud. Back in the boardroom, Richard ended the presentation abruptly, snapped the stiff folder shut, and announced curtly that the remaining agenda would be handled another time. The directors quickly gathered their papers, avoided conversation, and rose without a word. The sound of chairs sliding against the carpet echoed louder than usual, filling the space with an awkward unease. One by one, they left the room with restrained steps, careful not to meet their boss's eyes. Richard stayed seated for a few moments alone, staring through the vast glass windows at the city bustling below. Yellow cabs streamed down the avenues, crowded buses crossed intersections. Hurried pedestrians clutched shopping bags and briefcases, but the sight felt distant, like a projection on a screen he could no longer touch. He pressed the pen hard against the table until the metal clip snapped, a nervous gesture substituting words he refused to speak aloud. The authority he had cultivated for decades, built in every meeting with quick answers and firm speeches, now seemed fractured, fissures exposed before his own team. By early afternoon, alone in his office, Richard reopened the folder and stared at the document. The strange characters remained indecipherable, the faded lines marked by symbols he could not grasp. He shut it firmly, pushed it to the edge of the desk, as though dismissing it as an unimportant detail, but the act didn't erase his discomfort. He stood, pacing the breadth of his spacious office, surveying the shelves lined with trophies, medals, and framed certificates that had always reinforced his narrative of absolute success. Hours earlier, they had seemed solid. Now, in the silence of the room, each one felt more like ornament than proof. He drew a long breath, adjusted his jacket, and looked again at the city now flickering with evening lights. He decided he would bury the episode under layers of work, charts, and numbers, pretending it held no importance. Yet the memory lingered. The calm voice of a young girl, repeating flawless sounds in languages he would never master, echoing like a wound to his pride, a reminder that no matter how high he had climbed, there were realities forever beyond his control. The day carried on inside Caldwell Systems with its usual rhythm of meetings, phone calls, and constant movement through the corridors. But for Richard Caldwell, nothing seemed to fall into place. He went through his schedule on autopilot, signing documents without his usual attention, answering questions with clipped phrases, yet inwardly, he remained trapped in the scene from that morning. The girl's face, the precise intonation in each language, the director's uneasy silence as she demonstrated her skill, all of it returned in fragments, replaying in his mind like an echo that grew louder in every pause between obligations. Richard, a man accustomed to controlling narratives, now found himself for the first time as a spectator to something he had been unable to command. His attempt to turn the unexpected presence of an employee's daughter into a joke had backfired, and the result gnawed at his pride with the steady persistence of a drop of water striking the same spot over and over. The expansive office, once a symbol of security and authority, now felt larger and colder. The displayed objects, innovation trophies, leadership awards, photographs of him posing with politicians and celebrities at international events, each item meticulously arranged to reinforce his image of success, suddenly carried another meaning. Instead of feeding his confidence, they now looked like hollow reminders, a carefully constructed stage meant to impress, but powerless to provide the solidity he craved. He paced from one side of the office to the other, pausing at the window that revealed the city's constant flow. Down below, the crowd moved as always. Vendors on the corners, families crossing intersections, immigrants conversing in different languages on the sidewalks. For the first time, Richard noticed not only the movement but the diversity of voices, a linguistic mosaic that had always been there, dismissed by him as background noise. Now, every remembered syllable carried him back to the girl who had turned language into a bridge, a tool of genuine connection. Meanwhile, in Jackson Heights, life for Laura and Emily moved to its own cadence. Laura finished her shift exhausted, but with the sense she had witnessed something unusual. She walked with her daughter along the busy streets, simple grocery bags in hand, the scent of spices from Indian markets mingling with the aroma of fresh bread from Latin bakeries. Emily clutched her black notebook to her chest as though it were treasure. She spoke excitedly about the activity planned that afternoon at the community center. A small group of children would be learning greetings in Italian, and she was eager to show the colorful flashcards she had prepared. There was no trace of boastfulness in her voice, only genuine enthusiasm for the act of teaching. Laura listened in silence, reflecting on what had happened at the office. She knew that in such a hierarchical environment, her daughter's boldness might have consequences. Yet she also sensed that Emily carried no fear-only conviction at the community center. Emily followed her routine as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. She laid out her illustrated cards, asked each child to repeat aloud, corrected pronunciation with patience, turning mistakes into games so no one felt embarrassed. The simple space, with walls painted in bright colors and tables scarred by years of use, became an improvised classroom where learning unfolded naturally. Here, Emily became a reference point for the other children, a bridge between worlds. When a neighbor recently arrived from Syria showed up with her young son, Emily immediately tried a few words in Arabic, drawing a surprised smile from the woman. Laura, standing at the doorway, was tired but moved, realizing her daughter had found a way to expand horizons not only for herself but for everyone around her. Back at Caldwell Systems, Richard ended the workday with an annoying sense of incompleteness. The reports were finished, the goals aligned. The directors had delivered everything he demanded in terms of results, but the satisfaction he usually felt was missing. Instead, the insistent memory that a child from the outskirts had accomplished what he never could, speaking 7 languages with natural ease, chipped away at the armor of superiority he had always worn. Sitting in his leather chair, he once again opened the stiff folder, scanned the indecipherable lines of the manuscript, then slammed it shut harder than he meant to. He sat in silence for long minutes, staring at his reflection in the glass window. The city moved on outside, alive as ever, but inside him there was a noise he couldn't quiet. He realized, though he would never admit it aloud, that the morning's episode had left deep marks. The world outside remained unchanged, but something within him had shifted irreversibly, even if he had no name for it yet. The days that followed passed with the usual appearance of normalcy inside Caldwell Systems. Meetings were scheduled, reports circulated in digital spreadsheets, phone calls flowed in and out of glass offices. But for Richard Caldwell, the routine no longer carried its familiar automatic weight. He went through each commitment with mechanical gestures, without the conviction that had always defined him. And though the numbers continued to confirm the company's solidity, something pressed against him like a small stone lodged in his shoe. The incident with Emily replayed in his mind at the most unexpected moments, in the silence between phone calls, as his chauffeured car crept through traffic-choked avenues, or as he lay awake staring at the ceiling of his apartment, unable to rest. It was as though the girl had left a crack in his armor of arrogance, a fracture through which he now glimpsed things he once ignored. Hearing people speak different languages on the streets of New York, he no longer dismissed them as distant noise, but as voices carrying stories he did not know. The memory of Emily's precise French intonation, her firm tone in Arabic, and the cadence of her Mandarin followed him as an unsettling reminder of his own limitation. And it was this silent persistence that led him to ask, through his assistant, that Lavra Carter come to his office at an unusual hour, outside her regular shift. Lavra received the summons with apprehension. Returning home after her shift, she told her daughter that the billionaire wanted to see her in his office. Her expression reflected uncertainty. She was used to obeying without question, to making herself invisible in the polished building, and the thought of being summoned directly felt almost like a threat. Emily, however, reacted calmly. She showed neither fear nor anxiety, only curiosity. She asked if she could go along, and Lavra, hesitant, agreed, knowing that somehow Richard's interest had turned toward the girl as well. On the appointed morning, they dressed simply. Lavra chose her usual uniform, a signal that she would not pretend to be anything else, while Emily carried her black notebook filled with language notes, perhaps as a shield, perhaps as an inseparable part of who she was. They walked through the glass doors of the tower with steady steps, feeling the curious glances of receptionists and security, and rode the elevator to the high floor where the office awaited. Richard stood by the wide window overlooking Manhattan's endless motion. The man who always radiated authority appeared less imposing at that moment. There was weariness in his shoulders, a shadow of restlessness in his face. He greeted them with a restrained gesture, absent of the sarcasm that had colored their last encounter. He asked them to sit, dismissed the formalities reserved for executives, and cut off any attempt at rigid protocol. Emily sat upright, observing him with the same serenity she had carried into the boardroom. Lavra kept her hands folded in her lap, silent, waiting to understand why they had been called. Richard paused for several seconds before speaking, as though searching for words, and finally admitted that he wanted to understand how a 12-year-old girl had managed to learn so many languages without paid tutors, without access to the same opportunities he had bought for his own children at Elite schools. Emily answered simply. She explained that she spent hours in the public library copying words from borrowed books, that she watched free videos online, repeated sounds until her mouth adjusted, that she befriended immigrants in the neighborhood and asked them to correct her pronunciation. She described how she built her own tables to compare verbs, how she used sticky notes on the refrigerator and her bedroom walls to memorize vocabulary. She spoke of how she studied not only for herself, but because she believed languages allowed her to talk with people from all over the world, to understand cultures, and that she already shared this knowledge by teaching children in the community, giving small volunteer lessons with memory games and handmade flashcards. Each sentence came without vanity, only as a clear description of a disciplined routine fueled by curiosity. Laura listened in silence, moved by how clearly her daughter expressed what she had always seen at home but had never been voiced beyond their private circle. Richard listened without interruption, folding and unfolding his hands, sometimes leaning forward, sometimes leaning back. Each detail of her account struck him as revelation. He was used to viewing achievement as the result of heavy investment, expensive consultants, costly institutions, and now he saw that a child, through her own effort, had built a stronger foundation than many executives polished by prestigious universities. The realization did not only pierce his arrogance, it awakened something he could not yet name. Perhaps it was respect, perhaps envy, perhaps the dawning sense that he had underestimated human capacities that no spreadsheet could capture. When Emily finished, saying she did not know everything but that she dedicated herself each day to learning a little more, the silence that followed felt weighty, as though Richard himself needed time to absorb it. At last, he spoke again, this time without irony. He said he had reflected much since that meeting, and that instead of burying the episode, he wanted to turn the experience into something tangible. He admitted that he saw in Emily not just talent, but potential that could inspire others. He revealed his idea of creating a large space funded by the company, focused on inclusion, a community center offering language courses, professional training for parents who needed new opportunities, along with music and sports programs for children and teenagers. He explained that he wanted Emily's insight on how such a space could work, what the community's real needs were, and that he wanted Laura to continue in her role with security and improved conditions, as recognition of the effort she had always carried out. The words were halting, as though unnatural for him to express intentions stripped of profit, but they carried sincerity. Laura raised her eyes, astonished, unsure how to respond. She had spent her life hearing curt orders, unseen in the hallways, and now she faced an offer that seemed unbelievable. Emily remained serene, but her eyes gleamed at the thought of multiplying what she already did on a small scale. The girl who had improvised lessons in a modest community center now saw the possibility of reaching more children, more families, more stories. Richard's luxurious office, long accustomed to serving as the stage for million-dollar contracts, had become the setting for a conversation that reached beyond business interests. Outside, the city buzzed as usual, but inside that room, the silence carried a different weight, the beginning of a change born not from the power of money, but from the discovery that knowledge can emerge anywhere when met with dedication and the courage to let it grow. Richard opened a folder filled with improvised notes and slid across the table a set of neighborhood maps, reports on underused public spaces, and a rough cost summary his financial team had rushed together. He explained that he wasn't inviting Emily and Laura to be part of some symbolic gesture, but to contribute directly to the design of a project with daily operations, measurable goals, and a stable budget. He pointed to 3 potential sites: a warehouse near the subway with high ceilings and good ventilation, a former department store with entrances on 2 streets, and a partially vacant municipal building that could be shared under a partnership agreement. His tone remained technical, describing square footage, safety requirements, accessibility upgrades, projected energy consumption, and maintenance needs. But with each sentence, he looked for Emily's reaction, trying to gauge whether the spaces made sense for the kind of use she knew from her community center. Emily asked to see the photos, traced bus routes with her finger, inquired about natural light, asked if there would be room for modular tables that could be folded away after class, suggested movable panels to divide rooms without isolating students completely, and jotted down simple notes like safe entrance, drinking water, locker storage, quiet for reading. Laura listened closely when he described cleaning and maintenance routines, adding her insights on peak hour traffic, the need for constant bathroom supplies, the importance of lockers with secure locks to prevent loss, and the practicality of rubber mats to reduce slips on rainy days. The conversation didn't revolve around slogans, but around the details of daily use: children's arrival times, parents rushing between jobs, clear signage, simple enrollment, water distribution, and a snack corner with proper waste separation. Richard then presented the cost spreadsheet, saying the company would fund the renovations and cover fixed expenses for the first 2 years, including rent, insurance, cleaning, security, educational materials, high-speed internet, open-source software licenses were useful, and a small repair fund, while also seeking partnerships with local organizations for additional activities. Emily asked if there would be flexibility to invite volunteers from the neighborhood, especially immigrants who already led informal language conversations. Richard agreed and asked her to describe how those sessions worked and what obstacles usually came up. Emily explained that classes worked best in small groups of 40 to 50 minutes, alternating between reading, listening, and speaking. Younger children responded to picture cards and repetition games, while teenagers built confidence through real-life simulations like asking for directions, scheduling appointments, filling out forms, or writing simple emails. Laura suggested that vocational training courses be scheduled in the late afternoon and evening when parents could attend, and that sessions not be too long so as not to discourage those already tired from work. She proposed starting with basic computer literacy, resume writing, customer service, logistics, and household budgeting, plus an advice desk to guide families through bureaucratic paperwork, since lack of clear information often blocked simple opportunities. Richard noted it all down, asked for estimated class hours, and committed to hiring a pedagogical coordinator experienced in youth and adult education, without imposing a single rigid method, leaving room for adjustments as the center learned from real demand. Once the academic framework was mapped, Emily returned to the subject of music and sports. She explained that many children in the neighborhood had excess energy and focused better after channeling it in structured ways. She suggested percussion lessons with simple instruments, children's choirs, group guitar with chord charts projected on a screen, and activities in a multi-purpose gym, soccer, basketball, coordination drills. She emphasized that music helped younger kids overcome shyness about speaking out loud, and that breathing techniques from singing improved diction in any language. Richard asked what minimum equipment would be needed. Emily listed ball racks and jerseys, spare guitar strings and picks, protective cases, a digital metronome, a microphone for speech practice, and a small modular wooden stage for monthly presentations. Laura raised the issue of noise carrying into language classrooms and suggested staggered schedules, sports while other groups were in reading, alternating activities to avoid sound overlap. Logistics took shape in layers, labeled lockers, fixed timetables posted on visible boards, simple sign-ups with on-site assistance, communication by text message, and bilingual posters displaying rules and schedules. Nothing sounded inflated. They were pragmatic routines that, together, outlined a center that could operate without depending on lofty speeches. Richard brought up governance. He explained that the company would set up a legal entity dedicated to managing the center, with an advisory council composed of community representatives, 2 outside educators, 1 administrator, and a reserved seat for Laura as a company employee, ensuring that the perspective of day-to-day maintenance wouldn't be left out. Emily asked if there could also be a youth committee to weigh in on programming. Richard agreed, noting that the committee could meet monthly to suggest workshops, adjust schedules, and flag communication issues. To measure impact, he proposed simple indicators: attendance, participant satisfaction, completion rates, job placement after vocational courses, library use, and teacher feedback from nearby schools. Laura insisted that the less measurable aspects also mattered: safe entrances and exits, bus stops nearby, street lighting around the center, and relationships with local shops so the center wouldn't become an isolated island. They agreed to hold bi-weekly listening sessions with parents, led by someone from the community, free of jargon or barriers, to make quick adjustments without drowning in bureaucracy. When it came to staffing, Richard listed essential roles: pedagogical, coordination, IT support, specialized educators, a stable cleaning team, a receptionist trained in conflict mediation, unarmed security staff certified in first aid, and a building technician for minor repairs. At the mention of cleaning, Laura looked up and said clearly that she wished to continue her role at Caldwell Systems, with the same uniform and routines, but would gladly train the center's staff when needed, without taking on new titles that would remove her from the work she knew best. Richard confirmed her position would remain intact, with improved benefits and access to company courses if she wished, and asked her to help draft a realistic procedures manual daily, weekly, monthly checklists based on her real-world expertise. Emily suggested that neighborhood teens could volunteer in the center's library, learning to organize shelves, catalog materials, and help younger kids in reading corners. This could serve as an entry-level job program with a simple certificate, useful for their first resumes. The framework was closing in with concrete tasks and clear responsibilities, avoiding vague promises. Finally, the question of timing arose. Richard proposed a staged timeline: 30 days to secure the property, 60 days for basic renovations prioritizing accessibility, lighting, and ventilation, plus 30 more to equip classrooms, install networks, set up libraries, and test systems. A pilot schedule would follow, with small groups in 4 areas: languages, computer literacy, music, and sports, before full-scale opening. Emily asked that the pilot also include informal conversation circles with neighborhood immigrants as facilitators, not formal classes, but thematic talks about jobs, healthcare, transit, and public services, since many barriers disappeared. When someone explained exact procedures, Laura added that a small print desk would be invaluable, with daily limits per person, because many families stalled on simple tasks for lack of a home printer. Richard wrote it all down, asked legal to prepare agreements with city authorities and local associations, and ended the meeting with a clear list: site visits to all 3 properties the next day, a weekend neighborhood consultation, volunteer recruitment, and an inventory of donated materials, already available: books, guitars, sports balls. The plan was no longer abstract. It had taken shape as a sequence of actions with dates, names, and places dotted at the end before they left. Richard looked at Laura and Emily and asked if they accepted to continue with this work plan. No unreachable promises, only decisions tied to real use of the space. Laura agreed, saying she would help wherever possible, as long as her own work routine was respected and building staff were never ignored in decisions. Emily confirmed she would organize the language modules, invite neighbors already engaged in informal practice, prepare simple materials, and train young monitors to support the smaller groups, reminding everyone that things worked best when schedules were clear and parents knew exactly where their children would be. There were no embraces or grand declarations, only a straightforward agreement on a shared goal and a list of tasks, beginning with property walkthroughs and ending months later, with doors open, posters on the wall, desks set, and people walking in with notebooks in hand. Richard escorted them to the exit, asked his assistant to confirm the next day's agenda, and stood by the window as the afternoon stretched across the rooftops. The city carried on with its usual noise, but the folder on his desk now filled with maps, checklists, and practical notes signaled that from this meeting forward, the work would have to remain in constant conversation with the street, built less on speeches and more on the patient accumulation of small steps that, by week's end, would leave the center just a little more ready to welcome whoever walked through its doors. The technical inspection began early, with Richard, Emily, and Laura walking through the 3 mapped sites, each offering advantages and challenges that had to be listed without rushing. The warehouse near the subway had high ceilings and cross ventilation, but it was located on a street crowded with trucks making deliveries at unpredictable hours. The old department store offered 2 entrances and wide display windows that could be used for visual communication, plus a skylight that poured in natural light most of the day. However, it required reinforcement of the rear structure and a complete electrical overhaul. The underused municipal building came with the advantage of a symbolic lease cost, but strict shared-use rules that would reduce the flexibility to configure classrooms for languages, music, and sports. Emily used a felt-tip pen to mark bus stops, crosswalks with signals, sidewalk widths to accommodate strollers and wheelchairs, and nearby corner shops that could donate water and ice on hot days. She timed the walk from the subway station to each entrance with her phone stopwatch and noted whether the facades allowed bilingual posters visible from a distance. Laura inspected emergency exits, restroom locations in relation to foot traffic, counter heights for cleaning, drain valves, ease of resupplying paper and soap, and asked to see where pipes ran to avoid surprises with leaks. Richard, holding a clipboard under his arm, asked about electrical loads for the classrooms, estimated air conditioning consumption, outside noise at peak hours, and cost per square foot for 5-year contracts with escalated adjustments. He also noted the distance to the nearest fire station and health clinic. After a full round, they sat in a corner cafe and compared pros and cons, balancing real needs against budget. Pragmatically, the design converged on the old department store, which would allow the ground floor to be divided into reception, library, and modular classrooms, with the renovated basement set aside for a small gym, storage, instruments, and maintenance, while the skylight would become the heart of a silent reading area. The negotiations moved on 2 fronts: signing a lease with the property owner that guaranteed a rent-free period during renovations and exit clauses in case of hidden defects, and meetings with city officials to align licenses for mixed educational and light recreational use, accessibility standards, and a fire safety plan with marked evacuation routes. Caldwell's legal team prepared straightforward contracts, free of fine print that could complicate matters later, and Richard demanded a consolidated weekly timeline that could be tracked in quick site visits. Emily opened a grid notebook and began sketching classroom layouts with colored pens, a wide reception at the front with sturdy benches, a water fountain with a filter, and a simple numbered locker system. To the left, 3 language classrooms with sliding wall panels that could combine into a larger room. At the back, a library with low shelves, round tables, and a children's corner with rugs, picture books, and phonetic cards. To the right, a quiet study room with desk dividers and analog clocks on the wall. In the basement, a rectangular gym with rubber flooring, forced ventilation, safety nets, a storage area with labeled metal shelves for balls, jerseys, cones, musical instruments, and maintenance tools. Laura listed products and routines: dispensers stocked according to real usage, color-coded microfiber cloths by area, rolling cleaning carts with buckets, a weekly deep cleaning schedule when no classes were held, dirt trap mats at entrances, wet floor signs in 3 languages, and a visual manual for opening and closing with photos showing everything in its proper place at the end of the day. The teams arrived on schedule, and the renovation began with light demolition of partitions, rewiring, installing LED panels, leveling the basement floor, and applying moisture sealant to interior walls. The contractor set up a whiteboard in the lobby with weekly milestones, updated daily with completed, in progress, and pending supplier, avoiding confusion. Neighborhood volunteers, recruited through posters at the market and the old community center, came on weekends to sand and paint non-technical areas, following a light color palette that improved readability and brightness. They also donated boxes of used books to seed the library. A local electrician added outlets in the language classrooms to avoid extension cords. The IT team ran structured cabling with network points in every corner and tested redundancy with 2 internet providers. And a carpenter adapted donated cabinets with keyed locks and numbered tags. Deliveries arrived: stackable tables, rubber-footed chairs to reduce noise, ceramic surface whiteboards, projectors with spare bulbs, second-hand guitars refurbished by a street luthier, a percussion kit, futsal and basketballs with pumps, and spare needles. Security staff received training in welcoming families without intimidation and were instructed to guide rather than guard. Reception staff were trained in conflict mediation and first aid, with emphasis on child check-in and checkout protocols, emergency contacts, and colored wristbands for groups and outside activities. The pilot program launched on a small scale to test schedules and flows without external pressure. In the mornings, 2 adult groups alternated between basic computer literacy and Spanish conversation for shop work. In the afternoons, children gathered for reading circles and phonetic cards, while teenagers attended resume workshops and mock interviews. In the basement, futsal and coordination drills rotated in 40-minute slots between study blocks. Emily trained team monitors to support younger groups, showing them how to correct without embarrassing, how to take attendance, and how to log questions for the weekly planning meeting. She gathered immigrant facilitators in circles to align their conversation sessions around practical themes: making a doctor's appointment, reading transit signs, navigating government websites, and decoding automated phone messages. Early flaws surfaced without drama. Noise from the basement was louder than expected, so they added acoustic curtains and rescheduled sports. A projector lamp failed on the 3rd day, but reception staff learned to swap it in 2 minutes thanks to instructions taped to the unit. 2 groups double-booked a room, resolved with large printed timetables and a digital door panel showing occupied or free. Laura and the cleaning crew adjusted between block routines to reset floors and bins without disrupting classes, noting where carts blocked doors and relocating them. The neighborhood responded with curiosity and caution. Local shopkeepers praised the afternoon flow of families, but asked that registration lines not spill onto the sidewalks during rush hour. Reception adjusted with a ticketing system and indoor seating to avoid street congestion. A neighboring building manager requested percussion practice be kept to fixed windows so as not to disrupt his tenants. And coordination responded with a shared schedule posted in the block's messaging group. The local police chief suggested a technical visit to review exit routes and designated a meeting point for children separated from parents, summarized in a bilingual leaflet now stuck to refrigerators across many homes. Registrations, hesitant at first, gained steady rhythm through word of mouth and posters in the subway, with a waiting list forming for basic computer and Spanish classes. A library board logged completed readings with dated stamps not as competition, but as consistency records. In the quiet study room, analog clocks helped students track 25-minute focus blocks with short breaks, offered as practical guidance, not strict rule. Richard showed up at irregular times, walking slowly through the space, asking little and writing much. He watched reception staff simplifying poster language, observed the handoff between team monitors and hired educators, noticed the calm discipline with which classes began and ended, chairs stacked, boards cleaned, materials returned to labeled bins. He sat for minutes under the skylight where a natural light fell on the reading corner, listening to children repeat Italian words or practice short Arabic sentences from hand-drawn cards, while downstairs, the whistle marked circuit rotations. Laura moved around with her checklist clipboard, inspecting bathroom supplies, soap levels, faucet function, and dry floors, while coordinating with maintenance on a damp basement wall that needed extra sealant. Emily walked through classrooms, checking if activities matched the plan, collecting doubts for Friday's review meeting, adjusting time blocks, and testing new approaches for teams who thrived on practical challenges instead of rote drills. The day always ended as carefully as it began. Doors locked in order, equipment covered, lockers checked, trash sorted, a short internal report on the wall with 2 lines. What worked? What needs fixing? And a practical shopping list that included whiteboard markers, Velcro straps for cables, and more padded headsets for listening modules. Nothing asked for a stage. The work proved itself through steady shifts, layered adjustments, and objective records that, week by week, left the space clearer, smoother, and more trustworthy for anyone who walked in. The weeks that followed brought a kind of pressure that couldn't be hidden behind numbers or solved with a quick signature. And the way it presented itself had less to do with spreadsheets and more with the temperature of a room when certain words are spoken. At the board meeting, the agenda came in clean and left abrasive. The CFO didn't show hostility, but asked questions that unsettled certainties, wanting to understand how far this commitment would go and what it meant, in plain language, to sustain something that sold nothing in the short term. The independent director, used to hearing polished marketing stories, asked that they speak about purpose without adjectives, and Richard realized that the silence between one sentence and the next weighed more than the charts of growth. Emily was seated at the back, not taking the center, and when she was called to speak, she described simply how different groups found room to learn without canceling one another out. How an older woman who arrived tense at hearing Spanish gave up her spot with a smile when she heard her grandson say 3 words in Arabic. How a teenager who avoided eye contact began to write 2 lines after someone called him by name. Laura, standing by the door, listened without thinking about positions. She painted the daily routine with short images, said that caring for people begins before the door is opened and ends well after the lights are turned off. And that respect isn't a decoration on a poster. It's the way each person is addressed. Nobody clapped, nobody raised their voice. What remained on the table was the feeling that, on this subject, there was no room for exaggeration or slogans, and that the discomfort that had taken hold was less rejection than recognition that something was there which demanded courage from both sides, the one who invests and the one who sustains it with presence. In Richard's social circle, resistance came folded in napkins and jokes that seemed harmless until someone stared a second too long. At the club where he lunched on Fridays, his old business partners didn't make speeches. They asked sharp questions. If this wouldn't contaminate the discipline of the company, if people who had never stepped into the office wouldn't think, they could ask for everything. If he understood the difference between charity and management. One of them suggested he outsource his conscience, using the company's name as an elegant facade and leaving the actual work to those who live off social projects. Another proposed turning the initiative into a showcase with a giant logo at the entrance and PR events every month. Richard listened without raising his tone, leaning back, his fork resting for long seconds before a short reply, and he quietly extended invitations for them to visit the space without photographers, without announcements, without entourages, just to listen to what people had to say. The conversation drifted into a golf invitation he declined, not out of rebellion, but because the afternoon was already committed to a reading circle he had promised to attend to see how teenagers handled writing tasks. When he stood, there was no fight and no theatrical rupture. Only the awareness that that circle no longer offered him the same translation of the world, and that trying to decorate a room that did not welcome the subject would not make the subject disappear. Outside those luncheons, the reaction took on the tone of social media, and the words reached Emily in the form of comments from people who didn't know her. A short video, recorded by a father, showed the girl leading a pronunciation exercise and spread farther than it should have for something so simple, drawing genuine praise from those who saw beauty in the effort and cheap irony from those who saw an opportunity to belittle it. Some said it looked like a staged act to please a businessman. Others wrote that it was cute but useless. And amid that noise, Emily continued her afternoon with the group of teenagers waiting for her, without addressing the subject directly, but allowing it to surface when a student asked why learning a new word mattered so much if nobody from the important neighborhoods would ever care. She suggested a small game of replies, where each person turned a criticism into an honest question, and the room deflated the sarcasm as if a window had been opened. There was no uplifting conclusion, only an unexpected interest in going on. Lavra, during her shift at the company, heard whispers in the hallway that mixed curiosity with malice. She chose the path she knew, completed her duties, exchanged a nod with a colleague who told her, as they left the locker room, that seeing her daughter speak with such firmness had stirred something inside many households. That night, lying down, Laura didn't revisit the board meeting. She thought of the way the girl put away her notebook at the end of the day, and of the quiet message left by a mother who worked late, saying that, for half an hour, her son read. Out loud without apologizing. The neighborhood tensions didn't show up in protocols. They revealed themselves in the block, through the voices of those who truly lived the changes. Some residents feared the center would spark a line of expectations that had never been met, and someone suggested a simple meeting in the largest room to speak out loud about what bothered them and what worked. Richard chose a chair in the back without introducing himself and let the voices settle. A young man complained that certain hours seemed reserved for outsiders. A grandmother felt the languages she didn't understand became a barrier when her granddaughter just wanted to play. A young woman praised the music because it helped her overcome the shyness in the corner of the room. A local small business owner said that learning how to write a clear email was worth more than any motivational lecture. Emily asked to speak when the conversation circled back to language priority, carefully explaining that by alternating the focus each week, no one lost their turn, and that the place wasn't a parade of flags, but a long table where the chairs shifted without expelling anyone. She didn't speak of plans. She spoke of respect as a habit, of beginnings, middles, and ends for each group, of looking at the clock without turning time into an obstacle. The meeting ended without a manifesto, with people leaving through the same hallway they had entered, and the impression that remained was that when things are said in a normal voice, without microphones and without capitalizing on pain, the air in the room shifts and the edges stop feeling like blades. Inside Caldwell Systems, the team that once treated the project as a distant subject, began to bump into it through human stories. An analyst shared at the coffee station that her sister, a store clerk in the neighborhood, had managed to solve a customer's issue because she learned to write a short, direct message without apologizing for existing. A manager who avoided conversations off script admitted that his son insisted on visiting the space because he wanted to learn a song he'd heard while walking past. An intern volunteered to help organize books because her own childhood had been made of shelves no one ever had the patience to open for her. Richard didn't turn this into metrics or bulletin boards. He wrote down names in his notebook and realized that the resistance that had once appeared as a threat was beginning to dissolve into honest doubts, questions that invited instead of sabotaged. Emily, for her part, remained exactly as she had been on the first day, sitting on the floor with two children to review flashcards, asking a teenager to repeat a sentence until the sound came out clear, and holding steady with small gestures the thread of care that sustains any room where people learn. The place you occupy, the word you choose, the gesture you avoid, the patience you offer. Lavra maintained the discipline of someone who understands that dignity lies in the details. And at the end of another day, she closed her bag, checked the note stuck with a magnet on the fridge, and breathed unhurriedly, certain that conflicts aren't deleted, they're crossed with work and conversation, and that the rest falls into place when the city learns to recognize names that once went by without a face. 12 months later, the center already felt like part of the neighborhood, as if it had always been there, and the change was measured in people's roots, in filled notebooks, in dialogues that once stalled and now moved forward. Mornings gathered mothers and fathers in writing and conversation workshops, and stories of re-employment began to surface quietly at the grocery counter, at the bus stop, in the clinic line. Afternoons filled with annotated reading. Teenagers who once couldn't sustain 2 paragraphs began handing back drafts marked with questions, and educators adjusted their rhythm based on what they saw. At night, music and sports organized energy and focus, and the feedback came in small gains of confidence, firmer voices, more assured steps back into the text. Shopkeepers noticed clearer communication with customers. Workers reported fewer misunderstandings, and immigrants shared that they could now explain their needs without apologizing for every word. Schools requested alignment meetings and began referring students for reinforcement, not as an emergency, but as continuity. Inside Caldwell systems, the language shifted. Less jargon in product documents, more testing with nearby users, internal meetings that opened space to hear from the people who used what the company produced. Teams began visiting the center at quiet hours and carried back to their work simpler, more communicable decisions. The report showed steady attendance, course completions, and internship placements, but it was the accumulation of stories that solidified conviction. Richard recognized that constant presence pulled the project out of the realm of announcements and into the realm of routine. Emily continued with the same discipline as before, training monitors, taking notes on doubts, adjusting sequences. Lavra maintained the care that formed the foundation, the watchful eye that kept the space intact without asking for recognition. The neighborhood learned to use the house. The company learned to converse with the neighborhood, and that circuit closed in mutual benefit. When news of the Municipal Social Innovation Award arrived, no one had to pretend to be surprised, because the recognition seemed to merely name what was already evident. It wasn't a trophy for a shelf. It was a public validation of distributed work. The invitation came with a request that the people truly responsible and the faces that explained the origin be present. In the printed program, listed without unequal emphasis, were the coordinators, educators, reception, cleaning staff, Emily, Laura, and Richard. The auditorium filled with neighborhood residents, teachers, local press, and executives, and the screen displayed real images, conversation circles, open notebooks, tuned guitars, forms filled out without fear. The metrics appeared restrained. Active enrollments, attendance above expectations, completed modules, internships opened, re-employment recorded. Then came the faces. A small business owner reading a budget he had written clearly, a grandmother accompanying her grandson in reading, a teenager asking his first straightforward question. The center's teams were called on stage, followed by three people who embodied the story: Laura, Emily, and Richard. Laura accepted the tribute with steady footing, simple clothes, and listened to the thanks for the constancy that sustained each day. Emily stepped up with her black notebook, greeted her peers in 2 languages, and waved to the children. Richard took the microphone and chose to speak without metaphors, recalling the meeting that wasn't on the agenda and the challenge that wasn't in the plan. He said he had tried to turn a document into a token of power and found instead a reading that dismantled his certainty. He thanked Laura for keeping the house standing when no one was watching, because order and respect begin offstage. He thanked Emily for being a source of inspiration, not for the spectacle of 7 languages, but for the silent discipline that shows how knowledge circulates when someone opens doors and repeats the exercise until it becomes habit. He thanked the teams for keeping the calendar alive and the neighborhood for using the space as if it were their own, because it is. He acknowledged that Caldwell Systems had learned to measure returns also by what makes life easier for those who never set foot inside the glass building. He promised continuity without grand promises, just regular work, course after course, semester after semester. The auditorium responded with applause, and the award passed from hand to hand before finding its place on the wall of the center. There were no extra speeches or stage photos, just quiet conversation in the lobby and invitations for visits without entourages. At the exit, 3 generations stopped together to mark the night: mother, daughter, and executive. No theatrical gesture, only the clear awareness that this line traced both the origin and the unfolding. The next day, the skylight lit the floor. As always, reception updated the weekly board, and the house opened on time. Emily checked lists, fit in 2 new classes, and tucked in her pocket notes from children with newly learned words. Laura walked the hallway as she had from the beginning, waving, straightening a book, ensuring nothing stopped a lesson from starting. On time, Richard entered without announcement, sat nearby, watched 15 minutes of a writing circle, and once again thanked them for the meeting that changed his course. The award sat discreetly by the library, visible but not dominating, a reminder that recognition is consequence, not objective. The company maintained its monthly commitment of presence, and in return, the lessons filtered back into teams through clearer decisions. The neighborhood kept sending people, and the line of stories continued to grow with the same sobriety. The 3 knew nothing there was solved, only in motion, and motion demands constancy. Emily kept teaching without hurry. Laura kept caring without fuss. Richard kept listening without interruption. The workshops began, chairs moved, notebooks opened, and the city re-entered through the door with its familiar hum. Richard stopped, measuring value by silent rooms and static figures, and began to measure meaning by what routine unlocked outside. He traded the vanity of an indecipherable document for the daily act of keeping doors accessible. And from that shift, a purpose was born that didn't depend on a spotlight, sustaining, with resources and presence, a place where voices gain reach, where mothers and fathers find tools, where children and young people turn curiosity into a path. He recognized in Laura the invisible structure that made the house function, and in Emily, the spark that reordered priorities, and from there adjusted his own script. Less control, more listening. Less announcement, more continuity. Less fear of losing prestige, more commitment to what remains when the auditorium empties. The award hanging on the wall didn't close the story. It only confirmed the direction. Destiny, for him, stopped being status and became responsible work, course after course, semester after semester. And while the center opened and closed, in the rhythm of the neighborhood, Richard carried the same phrase as his compass for return. Thank you for that meeting, because within it lived the change that brought him here and the new purpose that kept him moving forward. The end. So, What did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.